This could be the biggest fight in Australian MMA history, and here's why.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your main event.
Live from HBF Stadium Festival Hall. Melbourne Pavilion. Not even backstage, we're literally outside.
Was that the best fight card in Australian MMA history?
Call me crazy, but make sure you call me when I'm right.
Be good if the Aussie MMA Instagram page would give us a bit of glow up because we're killing it.
Welcome to the Australian MMA podcast. My name is Mitch Tinley, and I'm just going to be breaking down talking about, if you will, the Australian MMA history-making fight that is Sean Gauci taking on Anthony Drilich. Dana White Contender Series are competing for a UFC contract. Hopefully you saw the video on TikTok or Instagram that brought you here, a little YouTube short. If you haven't, go check it out. Make sure you give us a subscribe and blah, 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 blah. And even if you hate everything I say, make sure you comment because it helps with engagement. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, what is happening is, as of recording tomorrow on UFC of Fight Pass, Sean Gauci, the Hex flyweight champion, is taking on Anthony Drilich, the Eternal flyweight champion. Both boys, I think 9-1, 8-1, going up against each other. They both have tremendous knockout power. They are phenomenal grapplers, and they all have sort of rubies in their belts in terms of why they should be number one. They're competing in Dana White Contender Series. If you don't know what Dana White Contender Series is, it's basically a TV show that Dana White, the president of the UFC, he sort of runs, and they have tryouts, a job interview, if you will. And not only if you win, but if you win convincingly and do really well, sometimes even if you don't win, but you do really well and you impress him, like Shannon Ross, fellow Aussie, who picked up a UFC contract, he sometimes still awards it anyway. So look, guys, if you're listening and you don't know much about the UFC, this will be fine. If you're balls deep into the sport, I'm sure you'll get a little something out of this too. Now, the reason why this is Australia's, I think, most important fight in the UFC is it's the first sort of time that we've had an Aussie versus Aussie in the show's history. Now, we've had Aussie versus Aussie before in the UFC, but it hasn't really felt to this level. Now, I think I even remember as far back as Steve Kennedy, Richard Walsh, I think maybe even not Coolabelle Malarkey, but there's something along those lines. Like, those types of fighters have sort of fought before. And look, it's decent. It's, I guess they kind of go whoever wins stays type thing, but it's never been of this magnitude. Now, to take you back to where I believe it all began, about a year ago, many people were talking about who is the best flyweight. Now, that is, of course, off the back of the soon-to-be legendary Steve Astro Boy Erceg, who was, I think, a 5-time Eternal MMA champion, and he got signed and eventually went on to compete for the UFC flyweight title against Pantoja, and unfortunately came up short, and he was probably what some people might think a takedown attempt away from being the world champion. So Steve Erceg basically saved flyweights for Australia, and from our part of the world basically said, hey, continue to look at what we're doing. Of course, the great Kai Kara France in New Zealand, who, unfortunately for Australians, he put him to sleep at UFC 305. But Kai Kara France doing great things as well. So both those guys really flying the flags for Anzac flyweights, not just the countries, but the flyweights in general, because they both put people to sleep. Now, ever since that sort of happened and we saw what flyweights could do, we were trying to find who will be the next Steve Erceg. And there were 3 men. There was Anthony Drilich from Eternal MMA. There was Sean Gauci, who was predominantly a Hex fighter, and Stuart Nickel, which was predominantly a beatdown promotions fighter. Now, Eternal MMA is, the most consistent, the most premier organization, if you will. And especially at this time, it felt like Hex was building up a bit of steam, and they were starting to sort of push to try and be number one. Now, Hex has done amazing things before. They've had change of owners and all that sort of stuff. But if you go back through their roster, they've produced many UFC fighters. Now, it made Sean Gauci, who was the former bantamweight champion, who then dropped down to compete for the flyweight championship, then won that. It made Gauci feel like he was either number one or number two. The person that was putting stake to that claim as well was Anthony Drilich, who was, I think, has fought as high as like welterweight, or he's at least been a welterweight. He's got knockouts at featherweight. He put Michael Barber to sleep at bantamweight. And then when he dropped down to flyweight, I think he had a tough split decision against Jamie Renouf. But other than that, he has put everyone else unconscious. It's just, look, he even beat, I think, Frank Jankowski, who's now the Eternal MMA flyweight champion. He beat him by rear naked choke. So Anthony Drilich can do it all. And if you're a Team Eternal guy, he was number one. Sean was number two. If you were Sean, he was number one. If you're a Hex guy, Sean was number one. Drilich was number two. But then there was this guy doing work in Queensland who wasn't getting much attention. If you even look at my Australian MMA website, the first article I ever wrote was, how much is a nickel worth? Because Stuart Nickel was undefeated, destroying people. But they just it just wasn't on the platform that potentially Hex and Eternal viewers were seeing. But if you talk to everyone, guys at Team Compton, Damian Brown, former UFC fighter, they said Stuart Nickel is the best prospect in Australia. So it started like a year-long campaign by media personalities, coaches, promoters, trying to make all three of these guys fight each other. And it just could not happen. Stuart Nickel, that you always heard that he wasn't available for like a year, and we didn't understand why. We soon found out later just why, but he copped unfairly a lot of shit, and people were saying he was quote unquote zucking the other guys. He was not. He, in fact, knew that he was going to be signed for UFC 305 in August of 2024. Now, he's represented by Ruby Sports, which is a very well-known management company. So they knew what they were doing with him. So Stewie Nickel just had to keep his head down, keep training hard, which if you've ever watched him train, he is phenomenal. And he was kind of doing his own thing. So then it kind of came back and forth between Sean Gauci and Anthony Drilich. Sean Gauci was even, spent some time training with Stewie Nickel as well. So they kind of half knew each other there. But Sean Gauci, I believe, had offers to fight at Eternal, and Drilich, it was reported from a very, very, very good source that Anthony Drilich was offered $10,000 to break his exclusive contract and jump on over and fight Sean. Now, all that bullshit aside, okay, don't care what promotion, don't care where, don't care if it was just at training. We all wanted to see this fight, but it could not be made. Now, there's no secret that a lot of the promotions in Australia do not get along. And then also when you have contracts, exclusive contracts, which now Hex have even brought in for some of their guys, it was proving more and more difficult that we were never going to see a fight between the golden triangle of flyweights. Now, as I mentioned earlier, around about, I think it was June, July, it gets announced that Stuart Nickel is signing with the UFC, not via Dana White Contender Series like we've seen so many other fighters, but straight into the promotion. Now, I've personally been invited to watch him train, and I know it's just training, but if you watch him train, the way he moves against a lot of the guys at Team Compton, I think he is special, and he passed the eye test for what it is worth with ye old Mitchell Tinley. Now, Stewie gets signed, and because of the patriotism of the guys in their promotions and their managers, and, Sean is a Hex guy, Anthony is an Eternal guy. Now, they all know managers, coaches, fighters that are all in the UFC. Word is that there was a bit of an outrage that Stewie Nickel not only got signed, but basically cut the queue to go straight to UFC 305. Now, there was in no disrespect to Stewie Nickel at all, but the fact that Gauci and Drilich just didn't seem to be able to get noticed was quite confusing. Now, Sean Gauci, who used to train in Melbourne, dominance under Sam Greco, Very, very accomplished martial artist himself and actor. And then, of course, he's trained with the great Michael Mano, who's, been a champion before and just an absolute stud of a guy. He made the move up to Queensland to train with Dunstan Death Squad. And I think he's signed with Jeremy Green and Panda Management. And they, a bit of an unknown, you weren't sure who they knew and if they could actually get him to the UFC. Very similar to Quillen, Sourkild, and Cody Haddon when they signed with Addict Sports with Jasmine Frank, shout out, who had never gotten anyone there to that level before because they were relatively new. Fast forward, now Addict Sports has, two, nearly three fighters in the UFC and looking like a viable option if you're a fighter. Now, Jeremy Green, like we said, we were not sure if he'd ever or could get anyone to the UFC. We did not know if that would happen with Sean Gauci. You then cross over to Anthony Drilich, who is represented by Rival Sports. Now, Rival has Rob Whittaker. So you think, geez, they should be able to get him there. Now, no one knows the full story, but from what I'm hearing, and once again, it's worth whatever you think it's worth. I'm just, at the end of the day, I'm just the woman's weekly of MMA. Now, I heard everyone started going, hey, I like to think of it like this. They went, hey, if you love Stewie Nickel, you're going to bloody love these two. That's my envision of the meeting. Maybe it went differently, but that's my thought process. And the UFC said, who? Then they took a closer look. Then they went, holy shit, these two are good. Because that's my only explanation. Because other than that, if you knew what they could do before and you hadn't signed them, ridiculous. So I only imagine they were like, sorry, we're not looking at flyweights. Oh my God, these guys kill people. Absolutely. Let's do it. So they said, while Dana White Contender Series is happening and the show kind of, the roster or the schedule, if you will, kind of gets released as the season goes. It's about 8 to 10 weeks of shows. They compete on a Wednesday morning, Australian time. Dana White watches the fights. Winner, loser, doesn't matter. If he's impressed, he gives you a contract. If you're thinking, why would they do an Aussie versus Aussie fight? It's because it gives validity to this story, which is they weren't sure. So they created a fight and said, well, I guess, we don't know who to take out of you two. We can't sign 3 Australian flyweights. We already have Stewie Nickel signed, sealed, delivered. We only got one more spot. And in the Joker v. Batman style, they just snapped the pool cue. They threw it on the ground and they said, you guys fight. Winner gets signed. Now, like I said, I have no idea if that's true. But it makes sense. Doesn't it? So we move on to the fight. The fight is going to be amazing. Like I said, I got a little highlight reel. Go check it out on the Instagram page, Australian MMA _, the YouTube shorts on YouTube or wherever, TikTok. Go check it out. Now, both boys can put people to sleep. Both boys, amazing grapplers. If you talk about the caliber of fighters and who they've beaten, none more a feather in the cap than Sean Gauci beating Steve Erceg. Be it in 2017, it's still one of the best flyweights in the world. Now, in terms of who has Drilich beat, Drilich has beaten so many people and knocked them out that are 20 kilos heavier. So he's been as heavy as 77 kilos in terms of welterweight. I believe one of his fights was at welterweight very, very long time ago. Now, Drilich, like I said, has that, he's got, as we used to call in Darwin, his hand sung. He has concrete in his fists and he can put anyone down. Sean Gauci can put anyone to sleep as well. It just doesn't feel as violent as Drilich. However, if I had to rank it, I'm going 9 Gauci, 10 Drilich, if that makes sense. And that is no disrespect. It's just when you watch the knockouts, I feel like Gauci's opponents get knocked out. Drilich's opponents get knocked dead. So that's my opinion. Grappling, I think we see it a little bit more from Gauci at times, but Drilich is one of the scariest leg lockers and he is a black belt himself, and he is phenomenal on the ground. This fight is as much of a stalemate as I have ever had in my life. I'm not making a prediction, even if I had one. If I had one, I would tell you I have no idea. I still think they should throw everything out, and it should have been a triple threat match between Anthony Drilich, Sean Gauci, and Stuart Nickel. But instead of sifting them through and just highlighting one, we need to elevate all three. At the end of the day, as much as I love the controversy at times and just talking shit and talking about fights, we as Australians in this sport, especially in flyweight, a division that was going to be cancelled, we have 3 Australians that are of that level. Now, Stewie Nickel looked very good against Jesus Aguilera, and before he got unfortunately choked unconscious, I think he looked amazing, and I think he's going to have a great career. And I do truly believe that Sean Gauci and Anthony Drilich are going to have a Forrest Griffin, Stephan Bonner style fight that will absolutely elevate the sport in Australia in the weirdest way. I think 2 flyweights are going to solidify our country in the sport on that stage. And I know that sounds bizarre, and you might not agree, but that's what I think is going to happen. I think it is going to be when we look back, it is going to be one of the most important fights in Australian MMA history. Now, if you disagree, of course, jump in the comments, death threats down below, or message them to me, because either way, it helps engagement. Thank you for listening, guys. Remember, check it out, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, I believe, or daylight savings, could be 11 a.m. UFC Fight Pass. Check it out. Sean Gauci taking on Anthony Drilich. Let's see who can pick up a UFC contract.